So today I want to do sort of an extended reflection on this really famous story from the Gospel of John chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in adultery. But in order to kind of frame this discussion, I want to talk first of all about this movie that I saw a couple years ago called The Unforgiven, starring Sandra Bullock. So major spoiler alert. So I don't want to go into this movie in a whole lot of detail, but suffice to say that Sandra Bullock's character plays this ex-convict who is basically in prison for many years for having killed the sheriff of a local town. And so the movie basically revolves around her character trying to reintegrate into regular life. And so initially things seem to go pretty well until people discover her past history, as a result of which people are judgmental, they condemn her, they beat her, that sort of thing. But then basically what happens at the end of the film is that there's a bit of a twist, right? And so what you find is that Sandra Bullock's character actually didn't shoot the sheriff, but instead it was her sister, Katie. And so basically Sandra Bullock's character took the fall for his sister to basically protect her sister from going to jail. Now for me, to be honest, when I saw that film, I thought it was a bit of a missed opportunity. Because even though I can appreciate why the plot would kind of have that little twist at the end, at the same time I couldn't help but think to myself, wouldn't it be so much more interesting if she actually did it? Like, what if it was actually her who shot the sheriff with full awareness and full intent and was now released after serving her time and expressing remorse for her wrongdoing? Wouldn't that be a so much more provocative film from a Christian perspective? Now, what's interesting is that in a certain sense, we don't have to wait for that film because that film is represented by this story that you find in the Gospel of John chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in adultery. So as a matter of background, with regards to sin, a lot of times we have to kind of factor in what we might call extenuating circumstances. And so, for example, maybe it's true that I committed a particular sin, right? So I am guilty of committing that sin in terms of an act or omission. At the same time, where it's relevant, I need to consider, again, what's called extenuating circumstances. And so, for example, maybe I was afraid. Maybe I felt compelled based on habit or based on some external force, that sort of thing. And of course, the whole point is that the presence of extenuating circumstances can reduce my own sense of culpability in terms of the thing that I did or the thing that I failed to do in the context of the moral life. But you see, at the same time, what's kind of interesting is that when it comes to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Catechism talks about what's called things which are intrinsically evil. And so the whole idea here is that no matter the intention, no matter the particular circumstances, if you commit this particular sin, you are guilty of something which is intrinsically evil. And so to cite a couple obvious examples, think about abortion, think about infanticide, think about genocide, or think about adultery. And obviously that's really important to know when it comes to this really famous story from the Gospel of John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. And so again, here's this woman, and she's guilty of an intrinsically evil thing, the sin of adultery. And what's more, she's caught in the very act of adultery. It's built into the very title of the story. And so right away, based on the theme of adultery, and given the title of the story, the question posed is pretty obvious. How does Christ look at people when they're guilty 100% of a sin which is serious, which is intrinsically evil, for which they have no excuse? Now, obviously, we'll get to that in a moment, but first of all, we might begin by seeing how the people respond in the context of the story who are not Jesus, right? And so what you see at the outset is that there's these elders who are basically willing to stone this woman. And so basically what they say to Christ is that under the old law, under the Mosaic law, they have the right in these particular circumstances to stone women such as these, women who've been caught in the very act of adultery. And you see, the thing which is actually kind of amazing and kind of shocking in a certain sense is that technically speaking, they're actually right. Because on a very basic level, all sin is serious. Certainly there's such thing as mortal sin and venial sin in terms of, various levels of gravity, but sin is an offense against God, and so therefore is very serious. And on that note, in the words of Father John Riccardo, it's very noteworthy that Satan and all the fallen angels lost heaven because of one sin. It's also significant that Adam and Eve, our first parents, lost the right to be in the Garden of Eden because of, again, one sin. Whereas in contrast, think about ourselves, people like you and me. We are guilty not simply of one sin, we are guilty of pages of sin, a multitude of sins, if you will. And so given all that, in the absence of God's grace, His patience, His love, His mercy, what do we all deserve? We deserve condemnation. We deserve death. We deserve some variation of being stoned to death. And yet, what do we find in the gospel? We find that in response to this invitation to have this woman stoned to death, Jesus does something, but He also says something. So first of all, what Jesus does is that he writes on the ground. Now, this is the only time in recorded history where Jesus is writing something, so it's kind of interesting to see what he's actually writing. The gospel doesn't actually tell us what that thing is, but St. Augustine has a really interesting theory. So basically, he speculates that what Jesus is writing in this particular moment are the sins of the elders. And so just kind of imagine a scene, right? And so here are these guys who are filled with murderous intent, in response to which the Lord silently bends down and starts writing on the ground with his finger things like lust, envy, pride, wrath. And if it's actually true that this is what Jesus wrote when he bent down to write on the ground, isn't it interesting? Because in doing so, the Lord would be provoking something in the hearts of these elders, leading them to consider that it's not so much them versus this woman, but instead the reality is that it's all of them together. All of them are sinners before the Lord, and so therefore all of them are meant to beg and plead for God's mercy, his forgiveness, his love, his patience. Now, of course, to kind of drive the point home, the Lord also says something. And so basically what he says to the elders is that, fine, you can cast a stone. The first one to cast a stone is the one who has no sin. And of course, in response, the people start walking away, beginning with the eldest, the people who have the most sins, if you will. Now, of course, when everyone leaves, it's just Jesus and this woman who was caught in adultery. And Jesus begins the conversation. And so basically what he says to her is there no one left to condemn you? She says, no one, sir. And then he says to her, neither do I condemn you. Go forth and sin no more. Now, of course, this is obviously arguably the most controversial part of the story, because it would seem to suggest that Jesus doesn't care about sin, that he doesn't even care about serious sins, intrinsically evil sins, like the sin of adultery. But in response to that, I want to suggest to you a couple things. First of all, this notion that God's grace, and certainly his love, and certainly his mercy, are all given to us freely given, freely received, never earned. And so even though we have this long-standing habit of doing penitential practices or saying prayers in reparation for our sins, individually and collectively, at the same time, when it comes right down to it, it is the Lord who chooses freely and willingly to forgive us of our sins. So there's that. But the more pressing thing to consider, and this is kind of more to the point, we need to always remember and keep close to our hearts this notion that the reason why our sins are forgiven is because of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Every time our sins are forgiven, it's not because we said prayers, it's not because we felt sorry, but rather it's because Christ suffered and died and shed his blood on the cross for our salvation and the salvation of the world. The difficulty, of course, for a lot of us is that seems kind of not real. It sounds kind of cliche to the point of not really actually impinging our hearts in the slightest. And so the challenge, especially during this time of Lent, is to revisit and recapture what it actually means when we say that Christ suffered and died for our sins, to make that real, to make it palpable, to allow it to influence in a positive way our conduct now and going forward in the future. And so to kind of help you in a certain sense, I want to lead you in a sense of sort of a guided meditation, if you will, right? And so kind of close your eyes and imagine a scene as I'm describing it to you. So imagine you're guilty of a crime, and it's a serious crime, something like murder or whatever the case may be, and you're 100% guilty. There's like no excuse, no extenuating circumstance to kind of lessen your sense of culpability or guilt. This is something you shouldn't have done, and you're 100% guilty for the thing that you did or the thing that you failed to do, and you're about to be sentenced for life. No parole, no chance of lessening your sentence. And then all of a sudden, before you're sent to jail forever and ever, never again seeing the light of day, never again seeing your family or friends, your best friend steps forth. And his offer is basically this: I want to do whatever it takes to let my friend, my best friend, go free. And so the thing is, I need him to be free today. No lag time, no waiting time, no processing time. Today he gets to walk through those doors and feel the sun in his face and breathe the free air. And I will do whatever it takes to make this thing happen. And so the judge, he says, okay. But then the price is that your friend has to be tortured and killed. And let's say this is what happens. And so let's say your friend is taken to the next room and you are forced to go with him. And you're forced to watch and to listen as he's being tortured, and you hear the screams and you hear the sounds of him basically dying. And then he dies and he's killed. And they say to you, okay, fine, you're free. You can go now, you're a free man. To say in that circumstance, well, look, I was set free because of nothing, does not do justice to the sacrifice made for you by your friend. Now imagine if that was real. Imagine if that actually happened. And imagine it's not just your friend, it's Jesus Christ, the Lord your God. And he makes the sacrifice willingly for you, such that again you might breathe the free air. The hope and expectation, obviously, is that you would not be indifferent to the sacrifice, but you would be filled with gratitude and have this willingness to pay it forward. And you see, therein lies a great shock when it comes to the gospel, right? And so Jesus doesn't want you to spend any time wallowing in shame or self-pity or simply feeling bad. He wants you to share in his life. He wants you to be happy. He wants you to be free. He wants you to love as he loves and to find joy in loving in that way. And you see, the test is not so much in how habitually you say thank you in terms of verbal expressions. The test arises when someone comes across your path and does something objectively evil and wicked, in the sense that they're 100% wrong and you're 100% right, and yet you're given the opportunity still to be merciful, to be patient, to love and forgive. In that moment, if you actively resist the temptation to go the way of anger, bitterness, rage, a lack of forgiveness, but instead, again, go the way of love, patience, mercy, paying it forward, well then truly you are beginning to understand what Christ meant when he said to his disciples, and by extension to each one of us, love others as I have loved you, and be merciful to others as I myself have been merciful to you. And may God bless you all.